The topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Well, hello and welcome. I am Bill Martinez, and we are live. Great to have you along with us, sharing a part of your day. Dr. Michael Rubin is back with us, a Middle East expert, talking about the latest from the Israel Hamas war. Dr. Michael Rubin is the 1945 contributing editor, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and former Pentagon official, talking about Israel in the Middle East, from the mounting international pressure, including from the U.S. for a humanitarian pause or a ceasefire altogether. The objectives is what we want to look at of all players, from Israel, Hamas, Iran, America, Hezbollah, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Russia, and China. Plus, what's next for Netanyahu and the PA's Abbas? What is Iran's end game here as well? Welcome, Dr. Michael Rubin. Michael, good to have you with us. How are you, sir?
Pretty good. Thank you for having me.
Well, I'll tell you, the last time you were here, you sent out the warning. You said that, the United States was on a little bit of different agenda. What Joe Biden was saying out of his mouth was one thing, but yet there were conflicting agendas. And of course, now here we are almost a month later, and those conflicting agendas, even within our own State Department, are quite pronounced, aren't they?
You're absolutely right, Bill. I mean, what I'd said before was that the two aircraft carriers weren't meant to deter Iran. They were meant to deter Israel. And I think subsequent events have shown that. Yes. Certainly, we see the case where the State Department and the Biden administration is acting in sharp dissonance to what they actually did before. So, for example, if you want to compare what's happening in Gaza to what happened in the fight against the Islamic State in Mosul and Raqqa. Well, when was the call for the humanitarian pause against the Islamic State? And I've been to both Mosul and Raqqa. The urban warfare there was much more severe than what we're seeing now inside Gaza.
Right. Well, and, it's amazing how quickly, Michael, it turned. And you and I kind of hinted to this, that the mainstream media would take the narrative and twist it around. Although there was a little bit of balance this week with the March for Israel in D.C. After all those marches across the country, pro-Palestinian marches. And, I believe what's coming out, through outlets like ourselves and your voice as well, is that we must not forget the difference between good and evil, right?
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, in terms of the moral equivalence, which we see, it's just been astounding. When it comes to anti-Semitism, which was always higher than violence against Christians, violence against Muslims, violence against Hindus, it's increased 400% even just since under the past month.
Exactly.
It really has become a problem, and the Biden administration seems unwilling to condemn anti-Semitism without talking about Islamophobia.
Well, and it's interesting, we're very protective of Muslims. And, the government's real quick to, talk about hate crimes. But look at the incidences of hate crimes against Jews in America. As you said, I think Christopher Wray said it quite aptly. They represent, Jews represent about 4% of the population in America, but yet are subjected to, as you say, at that time it was 60%, but now, the numbers are like a 400% increase of hate crimes and anti-Semitism.
Well, and simply put, when we're just looking at moral equivalency, when we're looking at the politics of this, look, you can sympathize with the Palestinian national cause, but it should be a no-brainer to say, I stand against taking civilians hostage. Exactly. I stand against holding pregnant women. I stand against taking babies hostage and using them as human shields. The fact that on our college campuses, people cannot say that with any degree of moral clarity is deeply upsetting. You know, earlier this week, I spoke at Bowdoin University campus, and so many people came out of the woodwork and said, you know, we're so thrilled to finally get an alternative voice, to hear the other side with regard to what's going on with regard to policy, but we're afraid to say that openly because of the social ramifications. When you have a college like Bowdoin, where you have elite kids, it really seems upsetting that the administration doesn't understand there's something seriously wrong if people don't feel that they can speak openly on campus in favor of certain mainstream political and foreign policy views.
Well, you make an excellent point here, Michael, because the fact is it lies at their feet. As you know, the administration, as the presidents of this university, you know, what is their mission but to, you know, protect, you know, the integrity of the university so that you can have a place where freedom of speech takes place, because that's where our intellect is expanded and enlarged, is it not? When we can have, we can have a fair conversation and debate about these issues, right?
I think you're absolutely right, Bill. You know, all this nonsense about microaggressions. First of all, they're micro. You should learn how to ignore anything which makes you uncomfortable if it's just an opponent's argument, something like that. But I'm much more worried about the macroaggressions. I mean, the world is filled with those who would do such an aggression as occurred on October 7th, when Hamas launched the greatest pogrom against Jews since the Holocaust. That's what we should be concentrating on, this notion that, you know, speech is violence or it makes me uncomfortable. What we're doing is, as others have said, coddling the American mind in a way which isn't healthy for our mental development, our intellectual development, or U.S. society at large.
I agree 100%. We're retarding their maturation process here, Michael, throughout this stuff. I mean, you know, we saw this starting to happen with performance trophies. And, you know, then it evolves into, you know, the point where you can't clap in an audience. That's disturbing. Words that you're saying. And, you know, as you say, all these microaggressions. And we're so focused on those, we forget the obvious macro ones, right?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, just not to harp on Bowdoin College in Maine too much, but the students I went to dinner with afterwards said that they're not allowed to talk about, you can't call someone a teacher. You can't you can't talk about teaching, because that denotes a power argument that you can learn, but you can't teach. And it's that sort of nonsense. You need to come in and understand as a freshman. You don't understand everything in the subject. There is much for you to learn. And I still remember when I was studying my Islamic history, the amount of time I would spend in the library, the amount of time I would be memorizing things, not because I would be able to relate them by rote memorization, but how can you actually understand an area without accumulating the basic facts in history? And that's something which a whole generation of school kids, university kids, are eliding.
Yeah, and the thing is, what they're failing to see here, Michael, just like you said, is the use of language. It trips you up. Now you're not, you know, all these years you've had a certain paradigm and a way of understanding language. Now you go into a different environment and you got to use words. It's kind of like I was sharing with somebody else when I went in the Marine Corps. You learned right away that there was a specific language and a syntax that you had to use even to go to the bathroom. I mean, and I know it sounds kind of funny right now and looking back at it, but it was like you're sitting there rehearsing constantly in your mind. Okay, how do I say this so I go to the bathroom that they're not going to throw me in a foot locker and you know, punish me because I didn't ask in the right Marine Corps way that I needed permission to go to the bathroom.
Hooah. Exactly. I mean, the fact of the matter is, when it comes to what's going on in the university campus, and what I've always done when I taught is, I mean, I'll argue, and I truly believe this, that people try to sidetrack arguments with discussions over vocabulary and terminology as an escape mechanism to avoid tackling the intellectual issues at hand. So I'll always say, we can argue on the side about the vocabulary, but don't let that distract you. Don't let the trees distract you from the big picture. And that's what too many people are missing. I don't care if you call, for example, terrorists Islamist, jihadi Salafis, or whatever term Islamic extremists is in vogue at the time. But we need to address the problem set as a whole. And that too often is what we're not doing. We're allowing ourselves to get sidetracked. And that's where political correctness truly does become corrosive.
You see, this is when it gets to be a bit of an insult, Mike, when it's about, it's about me winning the argument and debate, not advancing thought, not exercising, critical thought, so that as a result of our conversation, both of us are all the better for that. Isn't that to me, that's what I would hope would be the goal. But unfortunately, right now we're in a society that is so combative that it's more about winning an argument than it is about, and like you say, advancing the cause so that we're all the smarter as a result of the interaction.
Well, the only thing I'd push back on you all on that, Bill, is I agree with you, except that this whole notion of cancel culture is about not having to win the argument. And in fact, when I'm talking to students, what I'll always say is, if you're tempted to use a label, to label your opponent. And again, when I was at Bowdoin, there's a sit-in. They tried to cancel me. They said that what I had written about defending Israel and criticizing Hamas was racist. It wasn't. And the point I make is, if you're trying to use a label like that, you're trying to chill debate. You're basically acknowledging that you can't win the argument on its merits. And when I'm editing, and God help my students when I edit, if they're trying to win an argument using adjectives or adverbs, my mantra is the facts should speak for themselves. You shouldn't need an adjective or an adverb to win your case. I mean, it's that simple.
Yeah, I used to refer to it as the spirit of invalidation. If I can invalidate my opponent, I'm taking you off the field of play, right? Yeah.
And that's what they're trying to do. But, it doesn't work in the real world. And I think that a lot of these kids are going to be in for a world of hurt if they keep getting shielded by a university that wants to maintain an academic bubble. I'll go even further, Bill. As you know, I went to Yale, and I went to Yale in the 1990s, at the very beginning of the politically correct movement. Well, I wouldn't say the only thing to blame is the political correctness movement. Rather, the issue is this notion that students aren't adults and that they need to be protected from their actions, that they don't have agency. This whole notion of in loco parentis. Now at Yale University, there is a ratio of administrators to students of 1 to 1. Back in my day, if someone wanted to organize an African-American cultural night or a Native American cultural night, it was up to the student to organize that, and more power to them.
Right.
Nowadays, however, you have administrators to do that job. Everything is handed to students on a silver platter. They don't learn how to take self-initiative or do the struggle to see whether whether they can convince their peers that what they're doing is important, and everyone becomes the poorer for that.
Wow. Well, it's we got to grow up, Michael. I mean, we really do. And we need people, these administrators. And I understand sometimes, the paradigm gets you caught up in the bureaucracy and you miss out on the mission. And somehow there needs to be an awakening on these college campuses with these administrators to say, can we do better? Can we do better for the sake of the kids and for the sake of, the next generation of Americans?
Well, you're absolutely right. And today, and it's something I've been thinking of writing about, I've been looking at all these universities who are being criticized. They've had teach-ins, they've had various speeches, and they will always cite the fact that, on our university campus, we believe in free speech. Look, I have no doubt you believe in free speech. I'm worried about two things. One is quality of mind. And the second is, if you truly believe in free speech and intellectual discourse, then when you're having these teach-ins and these panels, why aren't you trying to have a more balanced panel that actually has people disagreeing with each other on the panel? Or are you trying to simply spoon feed an approved narrative? If it is the latter, then you have a serious problem, administration, on your hand. And all those potential donors are absolutely right not to give you a single red cent.
Well, and of course, we saw what happened in the last couple of weeks here, Michael, is that these donors are pulling away from these universities. these woke universities, and especially that are demonstrating anti-Semitism. They're saying they will have nothing with it. I say, good for them. Good for them to do that, because this is a lesson that must be learned, not only there, but also for these universities to take a look at all their revenue, all their sources of revenue. What kind of unfair influence are they having on the minds of our children?
Well, you're absolutely right, Bill. And one of the unspoken aspects of what you're saying when we're talking about sources of revenue is that there's a direct correlation between the universities which have had the most egregious examples of anti-Semitism and those that have received large donations, often behind the scenes, from Gulf states like Qatar, like Saudi Arabia, like Turkey. We're having the same problem with the Middle East now that we had with China before and their so-called Confucius institutes.
Exactly.
The fact of the matter is, while people say about think tanks like where I work, American Enterprise Institute doesn't take foreign money, but some think tanks do, and foreign money is corrupting. I condemn all think tanks that take foreign money, period. Exactly. But at the same time, the problem isn't the think tanks. The problem is the universities, which are far more corrupted than any institution in Washington.
Well, the fact of the matter is that once there's an accepted pattern, who can control it, Michael? You can't control it in government. We've got elites captured. We've got elected officials who are captured, by the communist Chinese. Follow the money. These Arab nations are, they've been quite revealing in this recent situation that has occurred in Israel. It's kind of amazing how kind of below the radar. And here we were hopeful that because of the Abraham Accords, we were going to possibly achieve Middle East. We had 4 or 5 Arab nations ready to come to the peace table and meet with Israel. And then suddenly here it is. I mean, and of course you talked about Erdogan a long time ago, and you said he's not what he seems to be, just relax a minute. And sure enough, he exposed himself, full on here in the past weeks. And just as these other Arab nations have, because they're not condemning Hamas. I think it's quite revealing to watch their position. Saudi Arabia seems to be playing it a little cool, because I think they still want to have relationships with Israel and continue to move in this peace process that they were moving. Qatar, as we know, they're so compromised and two-faced. It's wherever the wind seems to be blowing at any one time. Iran is clear. We know what to expect from Iran. They want the full demise of Israel. And of course, America is next, right? And you can just break it on down from there. Who is for us and who is against us, right?
Well, you're absolutely right, Bill. First of all, top line is when you have incitement over decades, it's impossible to remove it with a stroke of a pen. Right. That doesn't mean that the Abraham Accords didn't move things in a positive direction. And behind the scenes, when you've had this Islamic summit to address the situation in Gaza, Jordan, Morocco, the United Arab Emirates very much diluted the calls of the more radical regimes like Turkey and Iran to break diplomatic relations with Israel, to walk things back, to call a boycott for all of those issues. And so behind the scenes, the Abraham Accords, they're serving their purpose. At the same time, a lot of it is more complicated than perhaps this black and white approach in the news media seems. What was going on that caused Hamas to launch this attack now? I'd identify 2 things. First of all, you're going to have transition in the Palestinian governance. And the reason is Mahmoud Abbas, what is he, 84, 85 years old? He's in the 18th year of his 4-year presidential term. He's a chain smoker, and he hasn't created a successor. So you've got a situation there. What this was about was a struggle for Palestinian leadership, in which Hamas was trying to rally people around them so that they could make a move on the West Bank. At the same time, when it comes to the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, he's 84 years old. He's had cancer twice. He's partially paralyzed. Say what you will about octogenarian Iranian ayatollahs, but one thing we can agree on is they don't have a long lifespan. Now, he's dedicated his whole life to the elimination of the state of Israel. Is it possible psychologically that he wants to try to see this come to its fruition before he passes. Now, I've had this debate with Iranian studies people, Bill, and some will say, no, I don't think that's the case, because he would never risk everything the Islamic Republic has achieved, all of its structures and so forth, back home. But I'm not so sure that's the case, because I'm not sure he realizes how much is at risk, because they've put down the woman life freedom movement. He surrounded himself with a circle of sycophancy where, I mean, it's basically just yes men all around him. And therefore, he may not realize how much is at risk, which is why this is really a perfect storm.
Michael, let me interject this for just a moment and get your read on this, and that is the Mahdi. Because there's some Arabs that feel like the Mahdi is coming. They have this sense and anticipation, and that maybe this is the reason to finally go full blown here. Is that is anticipation by doing what they're doing, that they would promote the return of the Mahdi?
Okay, well, first let me give some Islam 101, Bill. The Mahdi, I mean, basically is much more of an important figure, not just in Shia Islam, but specifically in 12er Shia Islam. There's different types of Shiism out there, but the kind that's in Iran, the kind that's in Lebanon, we'll call them 12er Shiites. And the reason why they're 12er Shiites is the split between the Sunnis and Shiites occurred upon the death of Muhammad. Because the question was, who should be the successor? Those who became the Shiites said, I mean, everyone agreed, by the way, Bill, that it should be the most righteous person in the community. Right. Those who became the Shiites said, look, God chose Muhammad for a reason, therefore it makes sense to come through his family. And so they picked the prophet's cousin and son-in-law, Ali, and then had, I mean, usually from father to son, sometimes brother to brother, until you got to the 12th Imam, who was named the Mahdi, Muhammad al-Mahdi. Right. Now, he didn't die. He went into occultation, meaning he disappeared. And what Shiite theologians believe is at the end of time, he's going to come back with actually Jesus Christ at his side in order to usher in a perfect Islamic government. Therefore, by definition, until the Mahdi returns, government is by nature corrupt, unjust, and so forth. And this is where traditional Shiites lie, outside, like in Iraq, if you've heard Grand Ayatollah Sistani. Right. He doesn't believe in Islamic rule because the Mahdi hasn't returned. Now, what Ayatollah Khomeini, who led the 1979 Iran Revolution, said is we don't need to wait for the return of this Messiah figure, this Mahdi, because after all, Muhammad didn't separate mosque and state, so nor should we. We can be his deputy. And that's why the Shiite, the supreme leader in Iran isn't just the political leader. He considers himself the deputy of the Messiah on earth. Right. That's where that comes from. Now, here's where it gets tricky. Some Shia believe that just like with Christianity and the end of times and Armageddon and so forth, some Shia believe that before the Mahdi can return, there's going to be a grand war. And where the ideology gets very dangerous is they believe that they can precipitate the war. Exactly. Now, just in summary, Bill, or in a nutshell, you may remember between 2005 and 2013, there was an Iranian president named Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. And he really freaked out a lot of people because his rhetoric was so over the top, his Holocaust denial, all of that thing. What made him so special was he was the first Iranian president who wasn't a cleric. He wasn't a theologian. He actually came from an Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps background. And so many people saw him as a window into the thinking of the Revolutionary Guard. And when he started talking about hastening the return of the Mahdi, that's when people started thinking, you know, this guy, he wants nuclear weapons. He could bring war upon us. And this is where things get so dangerous. Now, make no mistake, this is a very much a minority view among Shia theologians, but that doesn't matter. It's the guys with the guns that matter. Exactly. And the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps are the ones who have the guns and believe this nonsense.
Wow. Well,
sorry about that discourse. Well, it's the problem.
No. It's so important, you know, because as you and I talked, I think the first time you and I talked, we talked about you know, how much the West does not understand about the Middle East. And again, you know, it's very difficult. I mean, you have been studying this, you know, for how many decades? And, you know, we're looking back, as my other Israeli friend would say, Bill, you don't understand ancient hatred. This has gone on for thousands of years. And I said, you're exactly right. And here we get presidents who come into office for 4 or 8 years, and they're trying to understand, thousands of years of history and nuance. This is like near impossible, Michael.
Well, putting on my history cap and being a history nerd, the one thing I would point out, Bill, is in this case, it doesn't necessarily need to be thousands of years of hatred, although it's a fantasy to believe that either Christians or Jews lived well under Islamic rule. They were minorities, they didn't have full rights and so forth. But what always gets me is in 1946, the intelligence office of the Department of War, which is the predecessor of the Defense Intelligence Agency, was charged with determining what the greatest over-the-horizon threats to American national security would be. And what they came up with was 2. The first was communism, which of course was a give-me given what was happening in Manchuria and the Azerbaijan crisis. The second was Islamism. Now, mind you, this was a year before the partition of Palestine, 2 years before the creation of the State of Israel. So if the predecessor to the Defense Intelligence Agency was determining that Islamism was going to be a threat to the United States and the West, what were they basing this on? And what they were basing this on was something called the Muslim Brotherhood. And this becomes important, Bill, because Hamas comes from the Muslim Brotherhood, Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey comes from the Muslim Brotherhood. But basically what the Muslim Brotherhood was it was a reactionary movement. Muslims believed that they were the perfect religion, that the Jews and the Christians had corrupted their revelation, but Muhammad revealed the perfect revelation. He's the seal of the prophets.
Right.
Now, then you get confronted by this fact that began when Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798, but continued through World War I and so forth, where you've got a situation. Why is it? Why is it that we are so weak as Muslims if we are the perfect religion? Those who became the Muslim Brotherhood said, the problem is we haven't been Muslim enough. We've been polluted by the West, and we need to excise all Western influence. In Egypt, that effectively meant killing the prime minister, killing the cabinet ministers are trying to, very violent movement to extricate Western influence. Same thing that without religion, that Mao tried to do during the Cultural Revolution in China, or the Khmer Rouge tried to do in Cambodia. That's what the Muslim Brotherhood is based on. And that's what the intelligence community recognizes as a problem. The problem isn't the grievance of occupation. The problem is the ideology behind Hamas.
Excellent. That's great. Well, the thing that's amazing is in recounting history, as you say, in 1946, if they identified then that Islamism was the issue, how in the heck did they think that Jews and Islam were going to be able to cohabitate?
Well, I mean, this is one of those issues in the past. When we look at the aftermath of the creation of the State of Israel, if you want to talk about apartheid, if you want to talk about ethnic cleansing, just compare the numbers of the Jews in various Arab countries, Morocco, Algeria, Libya, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, or Jews in Iran and Turkey before the State of Israel, or before even 1967 to now. I mean, in Lebanon, you're down to 5 from a population of more than 100,000. In Algeria, you're down to 0 from well over 100,000. I mean, the fact of the matter is, we are looking at this not with moral clarity, but when I say we, I mean university campuses, intellectuals, with moral inversion. And somehow it's become vogue in American society, and especially in government in the Biden administration, the State Department, to believe that sacrifice of freedom, sacrifice of liberalism is somehow sophisticated.
Yeah.
Wake up. It's not.
Yeah. And look at what's happened, as you say, in the process of ethnic cleansing. What's happened to Jews around the world as a result of this?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. But then again, there have been some shining examples which have been coming out of this. The support in India for the Jewish community, for example.
Right.
The support in some quarters of Europe. But, the Israelis should be worried because there obviously is a problem with a young population. We've already seen among progressive Democrats in the United States a willingness to tilt towards the wind rather than stand on principle. If you have politicians who follow the mob rather than set the agenda, then we are going to be in big trouble in this country. And the Israelis certainly should no longer count on American support.
Michael, it's interesting because this conversation ends up going in a bit of a circle, in as much as that it all comes back to leadership, whether we're talking about universities, whether we're talking about governments, our own government, and that is that where is the moral authority? Where is the leadership in all these areas that are so needed right now? And it seems that there's a clear vacancy of said leadership. And it's not just America. I believe the world is crying out for leadership right now.
Well, this is what frustrated me when I saw some of the headlines with regard to America standing alone and it's eroding our international prestige. I'm reminded back when Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland, sponsored something called a Conference Against Racism, Xenophobia, and Islamophobia, and so forth in Durban, South Africa, back in 2002. And instead of being a conference against racism, it became an orgy of racism, an orgy of anti-Semitism. And the United States at the time, under George W. Bush, refused to go. And you know what? It actually mattered. People care where the United States stands because we were standing for moral clarity. And by our absence, we were denying that conference the legitimacy people like Mary Robinson so clearly craved.
Yes.
Unfortunately, we are confusing leadership with a willingness with respect. And the United States shouldn't sacrifice the moral respect it has for the sake of being popular among the chattering class in Europe who have never found a genocide they couldn't turn a blind eye toward.
Well, Michael, I want to go back and focus on what's happening in the Gaza. The IDF is showing pictures of Hamas violating the Geneva Accords. I mean, what is there, 161 rules of the Geneva Convention, and clearly they have violated more than a handful, certainly involving civilians. Now we're seeing evidence where, in fact, they have been staging their operation in the basement of one of the largest hospitals, around schools, putting civilians at risk. And I guess the lack of outrage in the international community is such that it's quite disturbing. But thank God for the IDF showing these pictures that cannot be denied.
Well, Bill, first of all, I agree with you. And a lot of people out there, again, in the chattering class, misunderstand international law. Mm-hmm. The basis of the Geneva Conventions governing war and warfare and protections were that combatants had certain responsibilities. For example, they needed to wear uniforms, they couldn't hide among civilians, and so forth. And only if you abided by those rules were you given the rights of the Geneva Conventions. And this notion that the rights should apply universally, whether or not a group follows the rules, is actually very counterproductive, because if you suffer no penalty for having your headquarters underneath a hospital, or firing from schools, or using ambulances as a mode of attack, then what you're doing is encouraging that tactic in the future. Right. What really gets me, and the Middle East analyst Tom Gross has pointed this out, is back in the New York Times, back in the Washington Post, back in National Public Radio, going back to 2014, all of them referred to the Hamas tunnels and command post under the Shifa hospital. Mm-hmm. So if we could accept this back in 2014, based on their own reporters reporting, why are we trying to put this down the memory hole now and casting doubt? I mean, the only answer is many of these reporters are partisan to Hamas.
Mm-hmm. No doubt. Well, we saw that immediately, because it took no time, as we addressed earlier. I mean, within a news cycle, they had inverted the narrative, and this is where Hamas has been very effective in controlling the disinformation campaign.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. But part of this also is that within the press, I mean, my brother used to be a journalist down in Miami, decades ago. And back at the time, people would have to start on the beat and do the police beat or whatever, do the who, what, where, when, and why, and save the analysis for someone else.
Right.
What's happened is, especially after Watergate, there was this romantic notion about so many journalists had, where they wanted to change the world. That's not their job.
Mm-hmm.
And they would get credentialed from the Columbia Journalism School or wherever, not ever do the basic ethical work that taught them the study of journalism,
right,
and simply try to set a new agenda. Then there's this notion that in order to report accurately, you have to be from or of this group.
yes.
If you want to report accurately from the Gaza Strip, don't send someone who lives there. Send someone who's impartial. Send someone who's not going to be a member of Hamas. And this idea that journalists, freelancers or otherwise, were involved in the raid,
yes,
is absolutely astounding, especially when there's photos of some of them carrying grenades.
Mm-hmm.
What is the New York Times thinking?
Or CNN, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, it's like, no big surprise. I mean, CNN, remember here in the States, they got the tip on, was it Roger Stone's arrest, right? Somehow, just by chance, they happened to be there as Roger Stone was being arrested. So it's like, as you say, this has become, sadly, the standard of journalism, which is far from professional.
And when it comes to Al Jazeera, Bill, I mean, back in Iraq, what American troops learned fairly early is if they got a tip about an insurgent in a building, the first thing they would look out for would be Al Jazeera cameramen anywhere near that building, because if there were Al Jazeera cameramen, in all likelihood, it was an ambush. There was no insurgent. There was just a big bomb, and Al Jazeera is there to film the Americans getting killed. The fact of the matter is there's a complicity here.
Mm-hmm.
I was shocked when I lived in Israel doing a postdoc at Hebrew University back in 2001, 2002, to learn, and this was at a time of one of the big terror campaigns, so a lot of journalists flooded in. You could not report from the Gaza Strip unless you hired a Palestinian minder.
What?
Well, to me, that means protection money, and the New York Times, CNN, any of these camera crews should very much acknowledge that they have paid a certain amount of money for a fixer. Because while they can say it's to get this interview, I mean, with a nod and a wink, I mean, it's like the horse head in the bed. They're making you an offer you can't refuse.
Exactly. Yeah, we know that scenario. So here we are. Clearly, pictures are showing video. IDF has captured the video of this evidence, and as you say, in 2014, because we even had reporters here in America, I know from Fox News even, that were able to take a bit of a tour of these tunnels, and it's like, what did they think was going to happen with these tunnels?
You're absolutely right. And how were they built? I mean, where did the concrete come from? Where did the gasoline come from to power the generators to run the ventilation system?
Exactly.
I mean, then again, people also need to simply look at the statistics from Gaza before they spout off this propaganda. The life expectancy in Gaza is higher than it is in India and Brazil. Infant mortality is lower. The fact of the matter is, Gaza wasn't this open-air prison camp. And when people talk about Gaza being one of the most population-dense places on earth, well, I'm sorry, Tel Aviv has twice the population density of the Gaza Strip, and yet you're not saying boo when Hamas starts launching rockets at Tel Aviv. And the fact of the matter is there's something very, very wrong. We should never trust data from dictators or from authoritarian movements, and that's exactly what we're doing.
Well, and let's go back to your book, right? Your book that you wrote about, interacting and dancing with rogue regimes. I mean, come on.
You're absolutely right, Bill. I mean, the fact of the matter is, I mean, what the purpose of that book was way back when is when I worked in the Pentagon and when I circulated around Iraq and Afghanistan, what I saw was the American military was doing after-action reports all the time. You go out on patrol, the first thing you do before you take a shower, you get some chow, is you all meet and determine what mistakes people made. And the idea isn't to embarrass people. The idea is to keep everyone alive and operating at their greatest efficiency. And we do this at a macro level. Why do military units go to Gettysburg to learn about the command decisions there and discuss them through? It's all about after action. The State Department has never done a single instance of an after action report for a process of rogue regime diplomacy. What lessons can we apply from North Korea and our outreach there? What lessons can we apply from our past Middle East peace processing? This is why we're like Lucy holding the football for Charlie Brown, who winds up on his back, or it's Groundhog Day. We keep making the mistake time and time again, but since diplomats only serve 2 years in a post, we forget, or because, and I honestly think this is a key issue, everyone in the State Department is very, very smart. Maybe not wise, but very, very smart. And if you're going to make it to the top, you got to get lucky. You got to be in that area where there's a crisis. Well, or you've got to break some barrier. So you had Dennis Ross decide, let's meet with the PLO, something Andrew Young got fired for as the UN ambassador during the Carter administration. Or you had Bill Burns, who's now the head of the CIA, say, let's meet with Muammar Gaddafi. Or you had Jake Sullivan, as a young aide to Hillary Clinton, say, let's meet with the Islamic Republic of Iran, accept the same offer that every area studies expert said, they're not sincere, they're not the right people, don't do this. But Jake Sullivan doesn't care because he became national security advisor. It's sacrificing national security for the sake of personal ego.
Right. Well, it's tough, Michael. I mean, again, what seems to be missing is this clear moral leadership that has been a tradition for America. But it seems that for a number of decades, we find ourselves vacant of that moral leadership. And we're all paying a price for it. And I say all, I mean, not just America, but the world, as you pointed out, because the world looks to America for some moral clarity, does it not, even still?
I believe even still, look, there's a reason. Let me put it this way. I believe something like the European Union has 7% of the world's population, 25% of the world's economy, and 50% of the world's social service spending, which is why so many refugees flee towards the European Union than, for example, Saudi Arabia.
Exactly.
I mean, you'd think if you're a Syrian refugee, same religion, same language, so forth, easier going to Saudi Arabia. What they come to the United States for is for our freedom, for our liberty. And make no mistake, while the Europeans are very bad at integrating the Muslim population, on a per capita basis, the Muslim population in the United States is far more successful than the average American. So forget all this nonsense about Islamophobia. The point of this is people are coming for our freedom, and this notion that the younger generation is ashamed of America, that somehow the word America has become a triggering word, or the American flag is somehow symbolic of something other than freedom and liberty, really shows the rot and the cancer in our intellectual community.
Yeah, without a doubt. We've got a couple of minutes left here, Michael. And, going back to Israel, Hamas, we haven't even talked about, Hezbollah. I want to touch on that as well. But, it looks like we still have months ahead before the IDF, unless something really breaks through, for them to clear, through the tunnels and to clear Hamas out once and for all. And, and the next time we get together, we'll address what potentially is next for the Gaza.
You're absolutely right. I mean, one of the problems is, while it might be natural, and the Biden administration is leaning to this, of bringing in the Palestinian Authority, which after all was thrown out in a coup in 2007 by Hamas.
Right.
The problem is Mahmoud Abbas is 84 years old. So that's a major issue.
And he's not all that popular
he's corrupt as heck.
Right?
I mean, he's less popular. I mean, he's more popular than Hamas, but that's also partly the grass is greener on the other side. Right. The analogy which I would look at, Bill, would be the Taif Accords, which in 1992 ended the Lebanon civil war. And what you basically have was Saudi Arabia, under the guise of the businessmen, the Lebanese businessman, Rafiq Hariri, tried to guarantee the reconstruction, the aid. One of the things the United States is going to have to look out for, and that worked, by the way, until Hezbollah assassinated him back in 2005. What we can't allow to happen is Hamas to survive, because that will simply be a victory for them. Right. At the same time, you can't allow the people with blood on their hands to have a role in the reconstruction aid and to profit over the October 7th pogrom.
Exactly. Well, so how do you see this playing out? I mean, for me as an outsider, I don't know that you can even live with the the Palestinian Authority. It just seems to be also compromised. And can they bring back some semblance of order, to the Gaza, Michael?
Well, Bill, this is where I would throw the racism charge back at so many who want to defend Hamas and the Palestinians now, because this notion that the Palestinians don't have agency, that they shouldn't be held accountable for their own actions, that things just passively happen to them, is, in my view, racist. Right. If you want to respect Palestinians, you hold them accountable for their actions. You don't bail them out of their actions, and only then will they actually turn the corner and turn their shoulder to the leadership which has failed them so tremendously. Bill, I'm reminded of Anwar Sadat. People think of Anwar Sadat as a great peacemaker now, won the Nobel Prize, Camp David Accords, all of that. Right. But they forget that Anwar Sadat, before he decided to go to the Knesset to seek peace with Israel, he tried to achieve his victory through war. And he lost badly. Right. The only way the Palestinians are going to move forward is to lose badly, not to be bailed out. This notion that somehow we should give ceasefires, that the UN Secretary General is saying, and even Joe Biden, well, where was the ceasefire for the Islamic State? Would that have helped the people suffering under the Islamic State? We actually need to have some broader perspective here and understand that we shouldn't be repeating the mistakes of the past.
Well, Golda Meir said it quite clearly, Michael, as you'll recall. If Hamas put down their arms, there would be peace. If Israel put down their arms, Israel, in essence, would be annihilated.
You're absolutely right on that. But when you ask where things are going, Bill, as what happened with Golda Meir, who was caught off guard in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, she remained in command until the war was over, and then she was thrown out for her mistakes. Exactly. I suspect the same thing is going to happen to Benjamin Netanyahu. What's important here is, if he has nothing to lose, if his entire legacy isn't Israel's startup nation status, isn't its economy, isn't everything he's achieved so far, but it just comes down to October 7th, he's going to do his darndest to make sure that his legacy is eliminating Hamas once and for all. He's not going to listen to some senile old man in the White House.
Exactly. In the northern border, Hezbollah, it's like they're chomping at the bit. They're still sending in missiles. The threats of 150,000 missiles yet to come. What's happening there?
Well, first of all, the fact that Hezbollah isn't sending in 150,000 missiles, which they have, and by the way, which they got under U.S. guarantees and under UN supervision. They weren't supposed to have this. In 2006, Condoleezza Rice agreed to an augmented agreement. Regardless, it shows the failure of State Department promises. It shows the failure of the United Nations. Put that aside. Right. The fact that they haven't launched their attack is because of Iran. If Israel were ever to strike at Iran's nuclear program, Bill, the retaliation would be through Hezbollah launching those 150,000 missiles. So if Hezbollah goes ahead right now and launches those 150,000 missiles, what's the drawback to Israel striking directly at Iran? Exactly. None. And this is where Iran is very, very frightened. And that's why, for the time being at least, Hezbollah isn't going to attack unless they see a chance of the United States and the United Nations imposing a ceasefire on Israel. Then they may figure, we can just get away with this.
Exactly. Well, Michael, as always, we appreciate the time. Thank you so much for being with us. The information, again, is just absolutely invaluable. And you've become an invaluable asset to this radio show and to our audience. Thank you so much for being with us. Dr. Michael Rubin, the Middle East expert, the 1945 contributing editor, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and former Pentagon official. Our thanks to Dr. Michael Rubin, and thank you for being with us, sharing a part of your day. For more information and how to get behind this movement, to turn this nation toward God, check it out, BillMartinezShow.com. May God bless you and keep you. May make his face shine upon you. May he be gracious unto you and give you peace. Thank you so much for being with us. God bless. Take care.